Can you hear me? Today's scripture is from 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 8 through 12. Finally, all of you be like-minded, be sympathetic, love one another, be compassionate and humble. Do not repay evil with evil or insult with insult. On the contrary, repay evil with blessing, because to this you were called so that you may inherit a blessing. For whoever would love life and see good days must keep their tongue from evil and their lips from deceitful speech. They must turn from evil and do good. They must seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are attentive to their prayers. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil.
Thank you, Shoshana. Well, almost 11 years exactly ago, Meg and I were recently married. We packed up a 12-foot U-Haul with everything we owned, and we drove west to Wheaton, Illinois, to start our new life together. And there were a lot of things to do to start that life. Finding the grocery store, setting up our apartment, going to IKEA, of course, finding a church. But there was one important thing we forgot to do, and that was to set up a new bank account. You see, we both had banks here in the East, and we thought they had a branch in Illinois, but we were wrong. And so when it came time to pay that first rent check, we had no way to access our money. We had envelopes full of checks that we had received as wedding presents, but we had no way to get that in the form of something we could give to the landlord. So we were in a pickle. We also had fistfuls of Bed Bath & Beyond cards, but you can't really pay rent with those. So what were we going to do? We drove all over the western suburbs looking for banks. Finally, the Lord came through at the 11th hour, and we resolved it. We were able to pay our rent and not get evicted. But I share that story because at the time when we needed it the most, we almost couldn't access the money we had. And there's a similar principle in our Christian lives that our text gets at this morning. The principle is that what matters is not how much biblical knowledge we have, how many sermons we've listened to. What matters is whether we can draw on that to love others when it really counts. So, when someone in the church offends me, can I draw on the grace God has shown me to forgive them and respond in love? When my phone rings and it's that needy person again wanting to cry on my shoulder, can I draw from the compassion and kindness God has shown me to love that person? When someone does evil to me, can I go draw deep into that well of God's love that I've experienced and give back blessing? Being a Christian, friends, is about being able to love like Jesus when it really counts. At least learning to be able to love like Jesus when it really counts. And thankfully, God has given us what we need to do this. Part of that comes in the word he inspired this man named Peter to write to Christians long ago. And Peter, in many ways, is a good person to teach this because he has been on both sides. He once was a man who was not humble, not compassionate, not very forgiving. He was brash, he was bombastic, he was a little rough around the edges. But God softened him, God humbled him, God transformed him through the Spirit to be a person who gives back blessing when he's persecuted. To be someone who is capable of leading the church from its beginning and teaching Christians how to love like Jesus. So in this passage, and we are back in our series in 1 Peter, have been for 2 weeks. In this passage, Peter talks about two situations when love really counts. That first one is when relationships in the church are hard, and the second is when people do evil to us. So we're going to look at those two in turn. So first of all, in the church. Let me read verse 8 one more time. Finally, all of you, be like-minded, be sympathetic, love one another, be compassionate and humble. What a beautiful string of words that is. But sometimes when we read words like this, we forget that beautiful words like this are built for ugly times. They are built for times of conflict. When do you most need to be like-minded? When there's a conflict. When do you most need to be sympathetic and compassionate? When someone is hurting. When do you most need to be humble? When things don't go your way or when someone offends you. Now the words Peter uses, especially two of them, the word for love one another, which is have brotherly love, and be sympathetic, those two words were used most to apply to family relationships, biological family. In fact, it was a little strange that Peter was using these to talk about the church. Certainly not everyone in the church was related, right? I mean, in our church, probably half of our church is related, somehow, some way or another, back in Georgia. But he can't mean that everyone in their church was a biological brother and sister. The reason he can use that language reserved for families is because when we come together through Christ, we are knit into a new family. A family that is as strong or stronger than your biological flesh and blood connections. It's a truly revolutionary concept that the teachings of Christianity introduced. I don't know about your family, but at home in my family is when people see my true colors. They see my good side and they see my other side. My other good side, I should say. They see my raw, unfiltered, unpolished self, for better or worse. And I know that's true in your family too. But no matter how tough it gets in your family, you love because it counts, because you're committed to each other, because you're in it together, because you're family. And that's the same way it should be in the church. That's the same way it should be in the church. A few weeks ago, a woman in this church came to me concerned that she had offended one of her friends here. This person had appeared to be cold toward her one Sunday, and she figured that it was probably because of this thing that she had done. And so there was a conflict brewing. Well, this person could have brushed it under the rug. She could have, even worse, taken offense herself and assumed that the other person had been judging them. But instead, she chose to love when it counted. She went, and at the risk of an awkward conversation, she told her what she thought had happened, and they cleared it up, and they were back together, if not deeper in their friendship than ever before. Just these everyday things, these instances, is when we should be loving one another. That's when it counts. I want to ask you, is there someone in our church family that you need to have a conversation with? Is there someone who's offended you that you need to forgive? Is there someone who is there someone who's let you down and disappointed you, who you need to forgive and let go of that? Is there someone where it's become cold and you need to rekindle your friendship? You know, if you've been part of this church family, or any church, I would hope, for any length of time, you've been on the receiving end of these things. Chances are, you know what this feels like. That time that you got that diagnosis or lost your parent, and people were there giving you love and compassion and sympathy that just made all the difference. That time a brother and sister or sister in Christ came to you in humility when they could have accused you of something wrong you have done. That time when a brother or sister loved you when it really mattered. I know that you've all been on the receiving end of that. And you've given it as well, so keep giving it. And as one more application here, I would encourage you to look at our church membership covenant. We're actually in the process of trying to make church membership clearer and simpler and easier to understand. But take a look at the covenant we have right now. It's an excellent document that outlines our commitments to one another and to God together. And basically, this is 1 Peter 3:8 in a nutshell, church membership. So if you already are a church member, resolve to commit once again to one another through that covenant. If you aren't, I'd encourage you to take steps toward pursuing church membership, if you consider this your church home. Church membership is about being someone who will love when it counts, but on the flip side, you get a whole family of people who will love you when it counts most. Well, if verse 8 speaks mainly about relationships in the church, verses 9 through 12 talk about loving our enemies when it counts. Let me read verse 9 again. Do not repay evil with evil or insult with insult. On the contrary, repay evil with blessing, because to this you were called, so that you may inherit a blessing. One of Jesus' most radical teachings is a command to love and bless your enemies, people who hate you and hurt you. This does not come naturally to us, but often that is the real test of the Christ-likeness of our love. Jesus himself said it's easy to love those who love you, but what do you do when someone curses you or hurts you or gives you evil? How do you respond? Apparently, the Christians Peter was writing to were used to this. In fact, this was one of the main reasons he was writing the letter at all, was because these Christians were experiencing persecution, insult, scorn from their neighbors, and they didn't quite know how to deal with it. Remember, they were this weird religious minority in a pagan culture. They didn't go with the flow. They were not doing their civic duty of worshiping and praying at the pagan altars. And so they were accused of being, anti-Roman. Imagine how, Muslims were treated in America the day after 9/11. Just because of their religious practices, they were seen to be terrorists. That's a little bit like how Christians in this setting might have felt. Now, we don't share this same situation. You may not have been attacked or insulted for your faith, and yet, you do know what it's like to have evil done to you, right? You know what it's like to be bullied. You know what it's like to have your work sabotaged by a jealous coworker, or to have hurtful words thrown at you in the middle of a fight, or to be slighted by a friend. You know what that's like. And in those situations, we want nothing more than to give it right back to him, right? We want to hurt back. When we're insulted, we want to insult back. When evil is paid to us, we want to pay it back. In fact, we even use words like that, paying back or getting even or settling the score, as if justice were in our hands. But the thing is, when we do that, when someone does evil to us and we return evil to them, we become an evildoer with them. We are no better than them. And Peter is saying, based on Jesus, the way to stop that cycle is to return blessing instead of evil. He's not saying just be quiet and walk away. He says return blessing. Love them, bless them, be kind to them. That is the true test of our faith. Instead of becoming an evildoer, we need to give back blessing. There was a Christian soldier living in barracks with his unit, and every night before bed he would read his Bible and pray. This attracted the attention of one of his fellow soldiers, who would mock him and ridicule him for this practice. One night while reading, a pair of muddy boots came flying over and hit him on his bed. Well, the next morning, the aggressor found his boots, cleaned, polished, laid out at the foot of his bed, ready for the day. That's what it means to repay evil with blessing. And because this Christian chose to love like Jesus when it really counted, his enemy eventually became a Christian, and several other soldiers in that unit came to Christ and credited that act of love with one of the reasons they did so. Don't you want to be able to love like that? I don't know whether this is good or bad, but we have many opportunities to practice loving our enemies. When your child screams an insult at you in anger. When your Facebook friend attacks your faith or your politics in an angry rant. When a driver flips you off. When someone you thought was a friend betrays you or slights you. What will you do in these situations? Peter's saying, choose the way of Jesus. Choose to give back blessing. Let me be clear, too, about what this is not saying. Giving back blessing does not mean pretending to like somebody. One person asked one time, how am I supposed to love my enemies when I don't even like them? Love is an action, not a feeling. And so you may have to grit your teeth. You may have to act despite everything you feel and simply act in love. And choose to bless and choose to pray for that person, that God would bless them. Secondly, it does not mean that you trust someone automatically again. When someone hurts you deeply, they need to earn trust back for you to be able to open up to them in the same way you had before. Nowhere does the Bible say you should allow yourself to be wounded again and again by the same person and trust them. But part of blessing them and wishing them well is hoping that the relationship can be restored, praying for that, and working for that as far as it depends on you. Third, don't do it to try to change the other person. Bless them with no strings attached. And look at the text. This was actually a surprise to me this week. The reason Peter gives us to repay evil with blessing is not because it magically changes the evildoer, but because it's the path of blessing for us. Look at verse 9. Repay evil with blessing, because to this you were called, so that you may inherit a blessing. And then verse 10, for whoever would love life and see good days must keep their tongue from evil and their lips from deceitful speech. They must turn from evil and do good. They must seek peace and pursue it. Bless those who do evil, not because it changes them, but because it is truly a better way for you to live. It is the path of blessing for you. Listen, Jesus never asks us to live in a way that is harmful to us or that is worse for us. It's not a way the world recognizes as blessing, but when you bless those who hate you, you are close to Jesus and you receive his blessing. You're in the path of blessing. Let me close with a story that is imprinted in my memory as an illustration of this principle. 11 years ago, Meg's brother Luke and his wife Megan moved to a struggling city in northern Illinois to plant a church. Their vision was to start a church where there would be a community of reconciliation and healing and hope in the middle of a divided and broken neighborhood. And eventually they rented a small storefront space in the perfect location, and they began to renovate it. Month after month, and tens of thousands of donated dollars and hundreds of donated labor hours on, the space was transformed from a dingy, vacant office building to a beautiful, warm, bright church. And things were going great. The only problem was the landlord. This man was seemed bent on throwing wrenches in the gears. He would be picky about the smallest changes to his space. He would accuse them of damaging his property. He was all over Luke's back about the most insignificant details. And eventually it seemed that he was trying to get us evicted so he could cash in on the renovation and rent it to someone else who would pay more. This went on and on for months. Eventually he refused to renew the lease. And Luke felt all the things you might imagine that he would feel. Discouragement, indignation, anger, hurt. I would say even some hatred. Well, at the peak of this drama, Luke was talking to his good friend Joshua, and he was sharing about the situation, and Joshua looked at him and said, "Luke, you need to choose to forgive this guy and to pray that God would bless him." And so with great effort, Luke reached down into the love and grace that God had shown him, and he did just that. He prayed for this man. He wished him no ill. When we were evicted, or when we did not have a new lease, we left and found actually a better location. And this man continued in his evil ways, but Luke was free. The church was free. And the church was blessed because Luke had repaid evil with blessing. So, brothers and sisters, will you love when it really counts? Will you follow Jesus and love when it really counts?